there are a lot of doubts, there are a lot of problems with our knowledge-getting activities. 1,500 years later, and this was after the sort of great period in which, because of the powerful, influential position held by the Christian religion in Europe, and the Christian religion had its own view about knowledge. It said it knows the truth about the world, and so all you have to do is to accept the teachings of it. Back at the beginning of the modern period, in the 16th and 17th century, scientists and philosophers of that time looked back at what the ancient world had thought about the nature of knowledge, because at that time, in the 16th, 17th century, people were beginning seriously to want to distinguish between different activities that they were involved in. There were people doing alchemy and chemistry, people doing medicine and magic, people doing astrology and astronomy. And they wanted to be able to separate out which bits of their inquiries were really going to give them some good information and which bits were just misleading them. How do you tell the difference between astrology and astronomy unless you're clear about the kind of method that you're using that might get you knowledge? And so it became a very crucial question to revisit the skeptical arguments and to choose some of them that would help us, not to show us that we don't know anything, but to help us to know what we must do to refute skepticism so that we can be confident that we know something. And the person who did this in a very straightforward, very simple, classical way, was no less a person than René Descartes. Everybody's heard of René Descartes. He's the person who said, "I drink, therefore I am." And we've seen that on many a pub wall, I've no doubt, before now. Now, Descartes was not a skeptic, but he used some skeptical arguments to try to reveal to him what there is in our thinking or our experience which cannot be doubted. Is there anything that we think, or take ourselves to know, which simply cannot be infected even by the least taint of doubt? Because if there is such a thing, if there is a certain starting point, a rock on which we can stand, then perhaps we can, if we're very careful, we use our faculties responsibly, we can rebuild confidence in the things that we think we know. And so in a marvelously clear little classical work called The Meditations on First Philosophy, Descartes takes us through a series of arguments to try to show whether we can meet the skeptical challenge by presenting himself with some skeptical challenges. And I've no doubt, and I know you were very busy reading in the bath last night, but this would have been one of the other things you were reading, Descartes' Meditations. So you'll remember in Meditation 1, he says, well, I've sometimes been deceived by my senses, so maybe I can't really rely on them as a source of information. Remember, what I want to do here is I want to take any excuse to set aside something I think I know or believe. So even if it's a very implausible excuse, I'll use it just to see if I can sweep aside all my beliefs and claims to knowledge and see if there's anything left behind which is completely incorrigible, completely indubitable. So my perceptions mislead me, so I'll set them aside. Maybe I'm dreaming now, that I'm not awake and thinking about these things. Well, he said, even if I were dreaming, I could still know some things. For example, 2 + 2 = 4, and maybe all the elements of my dreams come from real experience. So dreaming, even dreaming, is not enough. So he said, I'm going to imagine, just for a moment, that there is an evil demon whose whole purpose in existence is to fool me about everything, even about 2 + 2 = 4. So everything I think I believe, actually I'm wrong about it. Just supposing there was such an evil demon. Is there anything at all that he can't fool me about? And of course the answer is that the demon could not fool him into thinking that he existed if he didn't exist. So the proposition, I exist, is true whenever you think it. And it cannot be doubted. So it provides a secure and certain starting point for trying to recover all the knowledge that one thought one had, or all the beliefs that one held before the enterprise started. By the way, little footnote, the argument, the I think, therefore I am, so I'm thinking, I'm doubting, I'm being deceived by a demon, but in order for that to happen, I must exist, so I'm completely certain that I exist. People have very, very often wondered just what the logic is of that argument, because it's an odd kind of argument if you think about it. Think about rather similar things that you might say. Supposing you were to say, I'm here. And people say that on the phone, don't you? You say, where are you? And he says, I'm here. So well, that's not very helpful because you don't know where here is for him. But whenever you say, I'm here, it has to be true because you are where you are. Or if you say, it's now, that has to be true too, doesn't it, every time you say it? But these seem rather sort of odd in their logic because they're very uninformative. Of course, when you arrive at a party, you can say, I'm here, and that has sort of more information for the assembled multitudes. But generally speaking, if you just say, I'm here, it's empty of information. So to say, I exist, seems a very slender starting point. And for that reason, Descartes needed something else, something that would help him get from his own consciousness of himself back to a world outside him about which he could have secure beliefs. He needed something. He needed a sort of guarantor that, if he thought carefully and if he reasoned precisely, that he would be able to arrive at secure beliefs. He needed something, a magic ingredient, X, just call it X, that would provide that guarantee. And ever since Descartes' day, right up until our own, people working in the theory of knowledge have been interested in this question of what that guarantee could be. What is the X that would help you build a bridge from the experience inside your consciousness to a world outside? Because that bridge is the bridge that refutes skepticism, which shows that the skeptical challenge to your claims to believe things and to know things can be met. Now, those of you who study here have done Descartes' argument, so they know what the magic ingredient X is. And the rest of you, ask the Sevenoaks students what it is. But it identifies the task that the people in the theory of knowledge have to try to go from the private data of experience to an outside world, to go from inside that helmet without its visor to some assurance about how things are on the outside. By the way, the great difficulty that the philosophical tradition has had in answering that question or solving that problem posed by Descartes has led various other philosophers to argue that to start from your experience is the wrong place. In their very different ways, 20th century philosophers like Wittgenstein and Heidegger and John Dewey, have argued that we should start not from experience, but from the fact, from the public realm, from the fact that we are sharers of a language or that we are participants in activities in the world, that this is what provides us with the basis for thinking about knowledge. We should begin out there and understand that the beliefs in here arise from these external facts, so that if we were to start there, we would overcome the difficulty that the skeptic poses to us when he says, how do you know that there's a world outside your head? Or how can you know anything about that world? But the really crucial thing for our present purposes is to note that Descartes was not a skeptic. He didn't use those skeptical arguments in order to demonstrate that we don't know something. He used them in order to show what we do know. He used the skeptical arguments as what we call a heuristic, that is, as a means, as a method for revealing something to us about the actual nature of our knowledge. And that is what skepticism, at its best and its most useful, is. It's not there to undermine our beliefs in things or to prove to us that we don't know certain things, but rather to show us what we need to do to make our knowledge more secure or to provide our beliefs with justification. If you like, skepticism tells us what our task is in the theory of knowledge, of what work we have to do to establish our knowledge. And in that sense, the skepticism is not problematic, it's what philosophers call methodological. It's just a method to help us understand more clearly. And it's that method which applies much more generally in our other inquiries. Think, for example, about scientific method. The great thing about scientific method is that it involves formulation of hypotheses, the rigorous testing of these hypotheses, trying perhaps, if you follow the thinking of Karl Popper on these matters, trying to falsify the hypothesis to show that it's wrong, to show where it breaks down. Popper always used to say that if you come up with an idea, that idea must tell you what would show the idea to be wrong. In other words, you come up with an idea, well, this kind of medicine cures headaches, so you know that if the medicine doesn't do that, if it doesn't work in the way that you predict, then there will be a result, namely lots of people with headaches who continue to have headaches. So you know what would disconfirm your hypothesis. So you come up with one, you devise rigorous tests of it, you look for counter evidence for it, you look to see how far your hypothesis does work. If it works, then you're entitled to make use of it until such time as other evidence or other reasons for abandoning it come along. But a very good result is to have the hypothesis disconfirmed by experiment. Then you know that you've got to adjust it or modify it or abandon it or come up with a better idea. And you do this in a public setting. If you have an hypothesis, you test it, it seems to work, so you publish the results, then other scientists can look at what you've done and test it themselves. Try to reproduce your results in their laboratories. There's a public scrutiny. There's an examination of claims that people make. So this idea of the self-correcting enterprise of science at its best, of course, we do read of scientists who occasionally make up their results because they want to try and win a prize or something, but generally speaking, responsible and proper application of the scientific method is one where there is repeatable public scrutiny, where skeptical questions about results are asked as a matter of course. Does this really work? Is this correct? Was the experiment right? Were the parameters observed correctly? Was the equipment clean? Was the hypothesis well formulated? Have we enough data? Is there enough statistical significance to the results of the data? A constant skeptical questioning to sharpen up and clarify and to make the results more secure. This is the same methodological use of skepticism. To be skeptical about the results and to look for different ways that they might be wrong, to look to see if you could undermine them or falsify them, to test and challenge them. That is the positive and productive application of a skeptical approach to try to make what we think we know better. And it can be generalized even further. It can be generalized to our daily lives. When we read newspapers, when we listen to broadcasts on television, when we hear testimony from other people, the information that they give us. And this perhaps is best and most sharply illustrated by the fact of the internet. The internet, which provides us at the speed of light with information from all around the world. And I like to point out to people that the internet is the biggest lavatory wall that's ever been built in history, because everybody can scribble their graffiti on it, and that means that most of the stuff that's on the internet is of some doubtful validity. And what one has to know by being skeptical, by knowing how to get information tested and evaluated, is how to assess the usefulness and correctness of things that one comes across on the internet. You have to remember there's a lot of nonsense out there, and that nonsense is iterated and multiplied and repeated millions of times at the speed of light. So being able to know how to make a good judgment, whether this website is reliable, whether the information on it can be tested independently, is a very, very important skill. It's a simple one, but it's a vitally important skill. I'll give you an example. Some of you here may have heard of Bernard-Henri Lévy, the most famous philosopher in France today. He of the décolletage. I don't know whether you've noticed, but if you've come across him or seen a picture of him, he wears plunging necklines. I once asked him why he does it. He's very handsome, by the way, and he has a rather magnificent coiffure. You'll notice that's a sort of trademark of philosophy, but he has a magnificent coiffure. He has a plunging décolletage, and he's very good looking. Once I said to him, why do you keep your shirt open to your belly button? And he said, oh, you know, I'm very hot. Anyway, a couple of years ago, he published a book in which he quoted a French philosopher of the 18th century, a very little known French philosopher of the 18th century called Boutule, B-O-U-T-U-L. Only to discover, after his book had been printed, that there was no such French philosopher, that this was somebody made up by some wag on the internet. It was a spoof. And Bernard would have noticed this if he had considered that Boutule's philosophy was Botulism. But he didn't check. And so he quoted this philosopher's book, and tremendously embarrassing to have been caught out like this, not checking his sources, not validating the information he got on the internet. And so he was quizzed on television about it. Oh, Monsieur Bernard-Henri Lévy, how can you quote this Botul, and he's just a spoof on the internet? And Bernard, to do him great credit, swift as lightning, he said, but what he says is good, you know, so I quote him, even though he doesn't exist. So, now there's an example of how you've really got to be careful when you get stuff off the internet and you put it into an essay or you base a claim on it and you haven't checked it, you haven't validated it, you haven't looked to see whether it's appropriate. And looking to see whether it's correct. Carrying out the enterprise of assessment and of validation is the practical and useful application of skepticism, of being skeptical, of asking yourself, is this right? What is the evidence for this? What is the reasoning behind this? I remember my youngest child, my young daughter, who, by the way, as all youngest children do if they are daughters, tend to rule the roost, don't they? They're the boss of everybody. And she came to me when she was about 8, and she said to me, I don't believe in God, she said, but I do believe in the tooth fairy. And now I've been bringing her up to be skeptical about things and to be a really good, reasoner, and to look for evidence and to be critical and skeptical. And this was proof that my method was working with her, because she had very good empirical proof of the existence of the tooth fairy. Every time a tooth fell out of her head, she got a pound. And also, it's actually literally true that there is a tooth fairy. It happened to be me, but there was one. You know, I was the person who was collecting her teeth, putting the pound under her pillow. So she had empirical evidence for that hypothesis, and she had very little for the other one. Her thinking about the other one reflected in a slightly more direct way that story which is told about the man who wanted a Ferrari, and he prayed for it, and no Ferrari turned up, and then he realized that that's not how prayer works. So he stole one and prayed for forgiveness instead. So there was a result of learning how to be skeptical. Learning how to be skeptical in the right kind of way. So as you see, the idea behind the skeptical impulse is testing, evaluating, looking for the evidence, looking to see how good the reasoning is. This is methodological skepticism. This is not a skepticism which says we don't know something. This is not a skepticism which says that's wrong. It's a skepticism which shows us what we must do to make our beliefs better and more sensible. Now, it happens that I've myself had a lifelong interest in skepticism as a philosophical problem, and have had the very great pleasure of writing 2 books about the subject. My mother used to say to me that everything goes in threes, so I suppose I shall have to write another one on skepticism at some point, and then people will say to me, why 3 books on skepticism? Haven't you solved the problem yet? And I keep on revisiting it. But what interested me in writing about skepticism is the challenge, really, to try to explain in the clearest and simplest way what is really at stake behind skeptical challenges, and how we could try to go around meeting those skeptical challenges. And that very, very clear and precise way of describing what the skeptic is saying, if you take all the different skeptical arguments, the ones about perception and about dreaming and about the evil demon, about error, take all those skeptical arguments and boil them down, what do they all come down to? Well, they all come down to saying this. This is a great moment to be awake, by the way, because this is really the nub of skepticism. That the very best evidence that we have for anything whatever, the very best evidence that we have, is consistent with us being wrong. Supposing you use the letter P to stand for a proposition or a theory or a belief, the best evidence that you have for asserting P is consistent with the falsity of P. That's what the skeptic is saying. That all our endeavors to gather the data, to look at it carefully, to draw some well-disciplined inferences from it, all our very best, most scrupulous and careful endeavors are still consistent with our being wrong. So how are we going to go around trying to diminish the possibility that we're wrong? And then when you begin to reflect on that, you begin to notice some quite interesting distinctions that you must draw. Another thing that philosophy is, by the way, is not just a challenge to assumptions and sifting of evidence, but it's also the drawing of distinctions, that is, of trying to make things really clear. And the distinction we need here is this. When you go back this evening and you open your copy of Descartes' Meditations, you will see that he says in the first meditation, what I want is to be certain. I want to find out if there's something of which I can be certain. And now you would think to yourself, surely there are two different meanings to the idea of certainty. One is, I can be certain about something. I can be certain that such and such a horse is going to win the Derby next week, but I could be wrong. So I can have all the best evidence, all the best reasons, but I could be wrong. Certainty in that sense is a psychological state, a feeling. I feel certain. I'm convinced. This is what faith is. If you have faith in something, you have faith in your motor car that it works properly, or you have faith in the BBC News, then you believe these things, you take them on trust because you have this subjective state of mind of being certain. But there's another sense of certainty, a different and an objective sense of certainty, and it's the one that we are really looking for when we try to counter skeptical challenges. And that is the certainty of the belief itself, the indubitability or incorrigibility, as people sometimes say, of the proposition or the theory or the belief, quite independently of what we think about it. So, for example, you take a formal example like 2 + 2 = 4. Now, of course, you will know that mathematical examples or arithmetical examples like that are not very good examples, because if you have a definition of 2 and a definition of plus and a definition of equals and a definition of 4, then you know that 2 + 2 = 4 is true by definition. If you change the meanings of those terms, you get a different result. Supposing you change the meanings of the arithmetical terms such that if you had two arithmetical terms, like 2 and 2, then the second occurrence of the term is always 1 greater than the first occurrence. So actually on the second occurrence, 2 means 3. Well, then 2 + 2 will equal 5. Right? Because you've changed the definitions. So that is something which is certain only because you've defined it to be so. That's not the same kind of thing as certainty about what's in outer space or what's at the center of the earth or what happened 1,000 years ago. And those forms of certainty are much more important and interesting to us than the kind that is true by definition. But the truths by definition, like 2 + 2 = 4, at least provide us with an example of what an indubitable proposition is. Just so long as you mean by 2 + equals and 4 what we normally mean in arithmetic, then 2 + 2 = 4 is an indubitable truth. Try it. Go onto the high street, stop passers-by, ask them, is 2 + 2 = 4 true? Now, if people don't call the police or an ambulance or something like that, they'll probably agree with you that it is. Why? Because it is indubitable, cannot be doubted given those definitions. By the way, change of definitions of arithmetical terms, you know all about modular arithmetic and so on. Remember what happened to Alice in Wonderland? She fell down the rabbit hole, had all those adventures. She ate the cake and drank the drink and made her big and small, nearly drowned in her own tears. At one point she said, everything's so strange, I better do my multiplication tables to see if I'm all right. And then she does them. 5 × 7 = 12, 5 × 8 = 13, and so on. And she's right because she's doing modular arithmetic to a different base. And this was just because Lewis Carroll was so clever with arithmetic. But that's a perfectly good example of how definitions can change things in a formal system. We, however, are interested in the informal system of the world of our empirical investigation. How are we to know things there? So you might say, somebody stops you in the street and says, how can we know anything? See, this person, you can tell that this person is having intellectual angst, and you can reassure them. You say, I'm from Sevenoaks, I can tell you that you can know things or have very, very powerfully justified beliefs about things if you are skeptical. If you will just apply the methods of skepticism. Ask, what's the evidence and how good is that evidence? How good is the thinking which has drawn inferences from that evidence? How do you evaluate, test, and explore the assumptions that lie behind that evidence? And if you can do those things, if you can look into the heart of the knowledge-gathering endeavor and understand how it works and how it best works, then you are a long way down the road to being able to think about things clearly and understanding them fully and having good justification for believing them. So skepticism is tremendously important. And not least, by the way, when you meet politicians. Only think if you were to read something in the newspaper, you're reading the Times, you say, "What?" And you rush out and buy another copy of the Times to check that what the first one said was true. Well, that wouldn't be a very good application of the skeptical method. You would need something else. And so you can see that being a good thinker, a responsible thinker, a good reasoner, and somebody who is well equipped to sift and evaluate information requires of you to be a skeptic. And then finally, and I end on this point now, what is the most important thing to come out with you from your education? Is it knowing huge numbers of facts? Geographical, historical, mathematical, scientifical, huge numbers of facts. Well, facts are important. You can't do anything unless you know some facts. You've got to have somewhere to start. You need a framework of understanding. You've got to have a kind of a picture of time and of space, of the world, of the universe, of the history of humankind. You have to have read, and you have to have read thoughtfully and attentively. You have to have absorbed as much as you can of the great conversation of humankind about all the things that matter to us. But above all that, what you need to be able to do is to be a sharp, clear thinker. And to be a sharp, clear thinker is to know how to use skepticism to evaluate and to reason and to see. So I recommend skepticism to you as a great tool in life, because to be skeptical is ultimately to be knowledgeable. Thank you very much.